Painting bricks is easier than you think, and I'm going to show you exactly how you can do it, no matter your skill level. Hello wonderful people, it's Genevieve, and my goal here on this channel is to teach you all about illustration and design. Now you can totally watch only this one specific video if all you care about is how to paint bricks, but I do want to mention that it is part of a complete digital art course designed as a month-long, 100% free YouTube series. So if you want to take on the challenge of improving your art skills, make sure to check the course detail on my website and make sure to subscribe as well as ring the bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming lessons. Now obviously, if you're watching this tutorial to paint bricks in illustration they already have, you would paint the bricks on there. But if you're watching the video as part of the full course, we are going to create a new canvas that is big enough so we can zoom in, but not too big because we're just going to be practicing on a sphere, so it doesn't need to be anything crazy. I'm just gonna go with the size of my iPad screen, as you can see right here. And once you have your canvas, if you're working in an illustration, you won't have to do that. But if you're just practicing, we're going to set the background to a neutral gray so we can really just focus on the texture and not have any distraction in the background or any kind of interference in terms of contrast. So just a neutral gray is really the best way to go when you're just practicing textures. We're also going to create a new layer that we're going to rename to base shape, and this is where we're going to draw the base shape of whatever we're going to have bricks on. So for practicing, we're going to draw a circle so we can have a sphere. And in terms of color here, you have a few options. If you want to download my color palette, it is linked in the description below. It's totally free, but as usual, I encourage you to try and pick your own colors because that's good practice for when you create your own illustrations. So we're going to start with just the basic color you want your brick to be. So I'm going to go with a normal brick color. And in terms of brushes, if you're working in Procreate, you can pick the 6B pencil from the sketching panel, which as you can see has some really nice grit to it. If you're working in a different software than Procreate, just try to find a brush that either has pencil or charcoal in the name and it should be totally okay. You could, if you don't have any other brushes, work with a base, round brush like that, but it's going to be a bit harder to work textures in. It's not impossible, but try to find a brush that has some grit. So again, charcoal or pencil should be pretty good for that. Now you're going to draw, like I was telling you, the silhouette of whatever you're going to be working on. So if you're practicing along the course, you're going to start for day one of the brick texture, which is a sphere, such as a circle. But if you're working in a real illustration, just start the base shape you want your bricks to be on. So now we're going to add some randomness in the color because bricks are not just one plain color. So to do that, if you're working in Procreate, you can swipe your layer with two fingers towards the right to activate Alpha Lock. You can also manually activate it in the menu. Now, if you don't have Alpha Lock in your software, don't worry about it. All it does is now everything we draw on this layer that has Alpha Lock activated is going to stay within the base shape. So if you don't have Alpha Lock, all you have to do is just be careful not to go outside of your shape, or if you do go outside of your shape, go back later with the eraser to erase the random strokes. So it's really not that big of a deal. So what you're going to do is you're going to draw random scribbles over your shape with a darker version of your base color. So it should look totally crazy like this. You're also going to go back in with a slightly lighter version of your base color, still in the same kind of area. So you don't want to have a color that's super saturated or super desaturated. You want to keep it pretty much in the middle. And once more, you're just going to draw random scribbles. So the crazier it looks at this stage, the better it's going to be in the end. So get your inner child out at this stage and just scribble away. So once you have a bunch of crazy scribbles like this, we're going to use the smudge tool to blend them in because that's not the right look right now. So the smudge tool is usually an icon of a finger, kind of like this, and it's available in most software, it's just in a different spot, so you probably can find it in yours. And if you're able to change the brush for your smudge tool, that's great. So usually in Procreate, I like to use the stucco brush from the painting panel as my smudge tool. I really like the texture of it, but for this we could use a charcoal brush. So you could go with, for example, the 6B compressed charcoal if you're working in Procreate, or the stucco brush. Honestly, both are great. And if you're working working in a different software, just pick again something that has charcoal and name should be good. If you don't have those available to you and you just have a soft brush as your smudge tool, that's okay as well. You're just going to make your brush super tiny, and as you can see here, you're going to go ahead and do a bunch of random scribbles, but with your smudge tool this time, and that's going to blend it in while still creating texture because you're going in with a super small smudge tool. If you do have a smudge tool that has some texture to it though, you can make it super big and really quickly brush over your entire piece, just like this. And still here, it should look a little bit rough because we're making bricks after all, so if you have a lot of texture, that's great. Once you have your basic texture laid out, don't worry, we're going to tweak it later of course, we're going to create a new layer so we can quickly sketch some guides for where the bricks are going to be. So just a new layer, you can rename it to guides or whatever, we're going to just delete it later so it doesn't really matter much. And you're going to pick a color that you know you're going to be able to see well on the rest of the piece. So here you can see I'm going with gray initially, but I'm going to change it in a second to green. And here you really want to make sure that you're drawing horizontal lines that follow the shape you have. So on the sphere, it's going to be curved lines, kind of like that. Now, if you're drawing on a wall, it's just going to be straight lines probably, but you might have a little bit of 3D in your piece, so this is a really good way of just making sure that your bricks follow the shape and don't just stay kind of flat when they should be curving away or something like that. So your guides don't need to be perfect at all, but they're going to be super helpful. So once you have rough guides, go ahead and create a new layer below the guides but above the base shape and rename it to mortar. That's hard to pronounce for me, but hopefully that was okay. So you could use whatever color you want here. I'm gonna go with a lighter kind of a beige color, which I'm going to add in the color palette. You can have it if you download it. I just forgot to add it, so it should be there now. And you're going to go back over your guides with the same brush you use, so a brush that has a bit of grit and texture to it. And you're going to make this mortar as thin or as thick as you want. And here, if you're working in a software like Photoshop and Procreate, you're going to probably have clipping mask. So in Procreate, you can just tap on your layer and activate it. Now, clipping mask is going to make sure that everything we draw on this mortar layer stays within the base shape that we have. Now, just like for Alpha Lock, if you don't have that in your software, don't worry about it. You can just draw your mortar and then go back with an eraser to erase everything that is going out of your shape. So take all the time you need here. You want to make sure that those lines look nice, and I was going to say clean. They don't necessarily have to be clean, but they have to be nice. So take all the time you need here to draw all the horizontal lines, and once you have them, we're going to add some vertical lines to create the brick pattern. Now, don't forget to hide your guide layer or completely delete it at this stage just to check that your actual mortar looks good, because sometimes when the guide is overlapping, it is just kind of distorting your perception a little bit. So hide your guide layer, make any adjustment as needed, and yeah, nothing crazy here. So adding vertical lines is really what's going to make this look like brick. So you have a few different options in terms of the pattern that you can use, but traditionally the staggered brick look is what's going to be, you know, the best way to go. I think it's just what people easily recognize as bricks, so that way you can make it easy on yourself and just have this classic staggered look. But if you want to experiment with a more artistic layout, it's going to be the same thing. You're just going to place your vertical line in a different kind of pattern. So once you have your vertical line, one key thing here to remember is to slightly round your corners, because bricks are rarely that pointy when you look at them, so just making sure they're rounded a little bit. Now later in the video, I'm going to give you tips on making your bricks look more realistic depending on the context they're in, and age is going to affect that a lot, especially it's going to affect the corner, so you can keep that in mind now. But since we're just practicing and looking at the main technique for now, just kind of round them a little bit, but keep in mind that you might have to round them more depending on the style of brick that you're working on. So this already looks a little bit like bricks, but we have so much that you can do to make it look better, including just making sure that the edges are not quite as flat as they are right now. So for that, you would deactivate alpha lock if you have it activated, so just swiping the layer with 2 fingers towards the right if you're working in Procreate, or just doing whatever else you need in your software. And then you're going to go back to the base color you used for your base shape, and you're just going to make the bricks that are on the side poke out a little bit. Because right now we have the mortar, which is, usually a little bit more kind of deeper in the wall, and the bricks poke out a little bit. So we want to give that effect on the edges of our piece, whether it is a sphere or a wall or whatever. We want to make sure that the bricks are a little bit taller, if I can say, than the mortar. So you're just going to go over your piece and do that. It shouldn't be too long. It really doesn't need to be perfect, but it's going to make a big difference, as you can see already, I'm sure. And with that, it is time for the secret password. So if you've watched this far in the video, please go ahead and comment wall. If you're new on the channel, you might be like, what's the secret password thing? Well, it's something we're doing in every video now. It's kind of a game. People seem to really like it. But it is more than a game, because it gives me a lot of insight into how to edit and pace my videos better, which is, great, because it helps me to create better tutorials for you guys, and that's just a win-win. It's also really cool because you guys know me, you see my face in the intro, you hear my voice throughout the entire video, but I have no idea who you guys are. So whenever you leave a comment, I get to see sometimes your face, sometimes your name, and it's just really cool to see who's part of the creative community that we're building here on this channel. So just leave a comment with the word wall, and then we're going to keep going. We're going to add a little bit more dimension to our bricks. So right now it looks like we have a bunch of paper rectangle glued to our surface, which is not what we want. We want to add a little bit of height to the bricks. So for that, we're going to create a new layer. If that's available to you, make sure it is a clipping mask. Otherwise, same thing, you're just going to go back and erase later. And you're going to rename this one to brick height. So here we need to figure out where the light source is in the piece, or where the light is coming from. Here, I'm going to imagine that it's coming from the top left, so kind of like this, but it could be wherever. And we're just going to outline the part of the brick that is facing the light. So in my case, it's going to be the left and top edges. So for that, we are going to pick a light color. Here I'm going to go with a light yellow, because I'm imagining that my bricks are outside and it's the color of the sun. And for now, we're just going to paint it like that. It's going to look absolutely crazy, but don't worry, later we're going to change the opacity and the blending mode so that it looks good. For now, we just want to paint them. One thing to keep in mind though, if you have bricks like this that are on the side of your piece and they're curving away, you won't draw the edges for those. Well, you're going to draw the top edge, but not the side edge, because the side edge is actually hidden. It's curving away, we don't see it. So make sure you don't draw that. This is not highlights, this is thickness of the bricks. So here I'm going to stop talking to let you focus. We're going to meet in the next step. We're going to do the same thing, but with some shadows on the bottom right. Great, so once you have your brick thickness like this, you can go ahead and play with the blending mode. So you could have different options here. I think I'm gonna go with luminosity, which is basically just going to take the luminosity of the color and not the saturation or the hue at all. And then I'm going to play with the opacity, probably putting it around 25% for now. But you're going to need to find something that works depending on the colors that you picked and the bricks that you're using. So you basically want to have something a little bit like this, where you see that there is some thickness to your bricks. Now for the color of the shadow, you're going to need to experiment. So I'm going to go with some sort of a kind of a dark charcoal color that has a little bit of brown in it, almost black. Honestly, you could go with black. So that's going to depend on the blending mode you're using, the opacity, the base color of your brick, but basically you just want to have a dark color or something that looks dark so that you can use the same technique, but this time, again, like I was saying, adding some thickness to the bottom and side of your bricks. Now, one note here, I probably should have said that earlier, but if you're working on a large brick wall that is not, the focus of your piece, you don't really have to worry about this step, because it's just going to, you're not going to see it in the piece if it's super small in the back. So don't worry too much about this. It's only if your bricks are really the focal point or they're pretty big, you do want to have some thickness to them, because otherwise they're going to look, like I was saying, like flat paper. And once you have both the light and the shadow part of the height, don't forget to go back and play with the opacity of the layer so you get something you like with both sides. So now it's pretty good. It's really starting to look a little bit more like bricks, but it's still quite flat. We have some shadows on the bricks, but we don't have shadows on the piece overall. So we're going to create a new layer above the mortar layer, rename it to shadows. And once more, if you do have clipping masks in your software, please activate it here. Otherwise, just go back with the eraser later. And for the blending mode, you can use either linear burn or multiply, and maybe lowering opacity around 50% for now, just so it's not overwhelmingly intense. In terms of color, I recommend you pick a color that is not just a neutral gray or a neutral black. You do want for shadows in general to have a little bit of a tint to your color. So I'm gonna go with a gray that has a bit of orange red in it, so it's going to match really well with the bricks. And you're going to paint your shadow depending on the light source, so the opposite side of your light source, in my case the bottom right, since my light source is on the top left. And if you're drawing a piece that is curved like a sphere, make sure that your shadow is curved as well, so it's probably going to look like a crescent moon for your sphere. And you can also go back with your smudge tool with the same textured brush to blend in your shadows. This is going to help you build more texture, and also it's going to be just much easier than when you're trying to kind of blend or create a gradient with your shadow, I should say, with just a paintbrush. Now, if your bricks are seen up close in your piece, you're also going to want to add some precise shadow under the bricks on the mortar. So it's one thing to have shadows on the piece overall, but if you think about it, the bricks themselves, since they're kind of poking out of the wall, are creating small shadows behind them, or below them, I should say. So you're just gonna go around, and on the opposite side once more of your light source, so here in my case, below the brick and to the right of the brick, just add a little bit of a shadow there as well. Now once more, if you're drawing a big wall that is not close and it's not detailed, don't worry about this step. It's just gonna take too long for no reason. But if the bricks are really in focus, or if you really want to practice the texture, this is going to make a big difference. Awesome. Now we're also going to add some lights, but they're going to be pretty chill because bricks are not reflective, so we don't want them to look like they're shiny. So we're going to just create one new layer on top of the shadows, rename it to lights. You can apply it as a clipping mask, you know the drill by now. If it's not available, don't worry about it. And we're going to use the blending mode add for this. Now add is very, very strong, so you're going to want to lower it quite a lot, at least 50%, but we're going to go back and lower it even more later. So you're gonna go back to the color you used for the lights on the bricks, so a super bright yellow in my case because I want it to look like the sun. And you're going to quickly brush a light on the part of your piece that is facing the light source. So in my case again, the top left. And as you can see, you're gonna go back with your smudge tool to smudge those lights in. Now here, this looks way too intense, so make sure that if it's too intense for you as well, you go back in your layer panel and lower the opacity of this light layer until it's barely noticeable, because once more, bricks are not shiny. We don't want them to be shiny, we just wanna make sure that we see the volume in the sphere. And just like we did for the shadow part of the detailed shadow outlining the bottom right part of every brick, we're going to do the same thing with the lights. So it's not going to be on the mortar this time, it's going to be on the brick itself, and it's only going to be on the bricks that are not in the shadow. So very important here, don't add highlights in the shadow, that just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But yeah, just adding these little highlights on the top left or whatever other face is facing your light source is just going to make your piece pop a little bit more. But once more, only do that if your bricks are super in focus and are the main part of your illustration. And as you can see, the lights are going to be really low-key. That's what you want. If they're too intense, it's going to make it look like your bricks are shiny, and that's going to make it look like your bricks are not bricks. So important to keep your lights very, very low opacity here. Now, if your bricks are in focus, you might want to add some details. So for that, you would create a new layer right above your base shape layer, so below everything else. You're going to rename this one to details, maybe applying it as a clipping mask if that's available to you. And you're going to color pick one part of the brick that is in the shadow. And with that color, with the same gritty brush that you've been using, so either a pencil brush or a charcoal brush, you can go back and add some little cracks and holes and stuff like that in your bricks, some imperfections. And that's really, really going to make the piece look so much more like it's made out of brick. Right now what we have does have texture to it. It does resemble brick mostly because of the pattern and the colors, but it's not necessarily looking like bricks. So adding a bunch of cracks, some section of bricks that might be kind of deeper, some holes, stuff like that is really what's going to make a big difference. But once more, if your wall is in at the back of your illustration and it's not the main focus, don't worry about that. Don't spend time on details, not necessary. If you do have details in your piece though, it's good to also go with a lighter color, so not just having dark details. So you can color pick a lighter part of your bricks, probably in the light area. And you can go and add details that are not connected to the dark parts, but you can also just go and kind of outline the dark parts. So you can really experiment here and try and see what works best for you depending on your piece. But basically, honestly, the main thing we're working on right now is we're just adding some texture to the piece, because we're working again with a brush that is either a pencil brush or a charcoal brush or something that has some sort of texture. So the more random strokes we draw, the more texture we build, and the more it's going to look like bricks, because bricks have a lot of texture. So it really doesn't need to be perfect here. You can see I'm going really quickly and there's no rhyme or reason to anything I'm doing, but it's already making it look so much more like brick. And right now this is way too opaque of a layer, so once I'm done placing everything, I'm gonna go back and play with opacity. But that's something I recommend you do as well. When you start painting, don't be afraid to paint with a really high opacity and then go and lower it as needed, because I don't know about you, but I tend to draw details and texture very light. I'm kind of scared of having them be too much, so I find that if I start with them being too much and then lower them a little bit, I'm a bit bolder in my choices, which overall is good when drawing textures. So just a little tip for you. And you can see now, if you hide your details layer, it's going to look super boring without it, so it doesn't take a long time, but it does add a lot. So that is the basic technique for painting bricks, but honestly, if you stop there, you're not reaching your full brick potential. So let's talk about some really quick, easy tips to bring your bricks to the next level. So now that we've looked at the main key elements on how to draw bricks, let's talk about the things you need to keep in mind when drawing them in context, whether it's with a reference picture or not. So if you're watching this video as part of the full course, now's the time where you can pause and come back tomorrow for day 2 of the brick study, where you practice the same texture, this time using a reference picture instead of a sphere. Otherwise, make sure to keep watching, because these tips can really make a big difference in the final result of your artwork. So when you are painting bricks, there are a few specific questions you need to ask yourself to make sure the texture comes across nicely, the main one being how old are the bricks? So on top of thinking about the regular coloring and shading considerations, thinking about the age of the brick is going to really help you work them in your piece. Depending on how old the wall, the building, or whatever you're working on is, then the bricks might have more irregularity in their shape. So think broken pieces, cracks, rounded corners, and just a wider variety of colors and textures in general. So basically, the older your wall is, the more all over the places the bricks are going to get, especially if it's outside. Now the mortar might also change color, and it might also recede in the wall, so it might be a little bit deeper, and you might also have some moss in some parts. So the key here is to keep those questions in mind when creating your own piece or drawing from a reference picture, so that you can build, no pun intended, on the basic brick painting technique and really customize your artwork. Now, if you're interested in adding moss to your bricks, I do have a tutorial from last year, 30 Days of Digital Art, that you can check out. But before you leave, make sure you give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the weekly videos. Then click on the link right here, and I'll see you there.